Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Abdul Wahab Al-Kibsi. I'm Abdu to my friends, so to all of you, I hope. And I'm the Regional Director for the Africa and Middle East programs here at the Center for International Private Enterprise. Before I introduce the speakers, I just wanted to introduce Dr. John Sullivan, who's the Executive Director of CIPE. He was part of the establishment of CIPE and the entire NED process for democracy support and strengthening around the world. I also want to introduce Steve Rosenland, who oversees our programs in Syria and the Levant, and Sarah Hudak, if she's here, who works with him on that portfolio. She's probably outside. She'll be in a minute. CIPE is a democracy that strengthens, is an organization that strengthens democracy around the globe through market reforms and working with the private sector. And we have programs all over the world, and the Middle East is an ever-growing region, and Syria in particular has been an area of interest for us. Today, we have three speakers who have a lot of experience working on economic issues in Syria in particular. We have Mr. Ayman Tabbaa, who's a Syrian businessman. He's a founding member of the Syrian Economic Forum and has established and run a business in Syria for many, many years. He had to leave Syria because of prosecution, because of his work with the Syrian Economic Forum. To my left, we have Dr. Samer Abboud, who teaches at the University of Arcadia and who's a political economy expert specifically on Syria. And to my right, Mr. Faysal Itani, who's a fellow at the Rafik Hariri Center of the Atlantic Council, and he's also a political economist and an expert on political economy of Syria. I'm not going to talk for a long time, but we all know about what's going on in Syria, up to, if not more than 70,000 people killed. This is something that cannot be replaced. Losing 70,000 people, men, women, and children in Syria is probably the most and the dire effect that the country is going through, and the devastation in Syria. But today we're focusing on the economy of Syria. I understand that up to 50% unemployment, especially among the youth in Syria. These young men and women, especially men, if they don't have jobs, if the economy does not improve, instead of becoming a boon and a support for the growth in Syria, will be a devastating effect. We're seeing what's going on in Egypt, we're seeing what's going on in Tunisia, we're seeing especially what's going on in Libya, and we're hoping that that will not be the case in Syria if economic reforms happen as we hope they will. I'm not going to take long. Maybe we should start with Ayman to give us maybe 5 to 10 minute presentation, followed by Samer, and then we'll finish with Faysal, and hopefully we'll have enough time for question and answer. Can this reach you?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank CIPE for hosting this event. And I would like to thank you guys for attending this event. I'm pretty sure that you're all hungry to hear about the news in Syria. It's actually the hot topic right now. It's actually very hard for me to talk about my country right now. It's a wounded country that it's going through a revolution that it was actually what we call the blessed revolution, as much as it has a lot of positive issues. Also, it does have a negative issue as well, just like any other revolutions. And this negative issue, in our particular case, actually reflected on the economy. A lot of people lost their jobs, just like Abdul was saying. More than 50% of people are unemployed. Syria has lost more than 45% of GDP. More than 5 million people inside Syria has been displaced. They moved from their areas to a safer area, but with those areas actually there's no jobs, there's no homes basically for them. More than 1 million people were outside in refugee camps, whether it was in Lebanon or in Jordan or in Turkey. Actually, the estimated numbers right now is like almost between 3,000 to 5,000 people every day goes to Jordan, to the camps in Jordan. Now, if if we want to have a better view about the future, I believe we have to have a better understanding about the past, about what this regime did to this country. The regime for the past 50 years, actually, he basically occupied the country, or occupied Syria. And he drove the country in a very systematic way in destruction of the economy, of the Syrian economy. He let just a few people to control the whole economy. And actually from the statement of the Ministry of Finance in Syria, which is just recently has been let go from his job, only 9 people in Syria, 9 individual people, control 70% of the Syrian economy. And that is, in a country like Syria, which there's 23 million in there, that's a significant number. I mean, when you see 9 people only controlling this. Now, during all these years, most of what the regime did to the country basically is trying to destroy the economy. One of them is by spreading the corruption in this country. And actually, you know what, I want to share a story with you. I just got it in my mind right now. In 2005, I was in Syria, and I presented a project to the government. The project was, actually, it was a unique project. It's never done before in Syria. It was a huge project. It's called the air ambulance. Basically, we have a lot of accidents on the roads because the roads were not that safe, actually not safe at all. And I was providing to provide 5 helicopters to go around the Syria on the highways between the cities, and to help in rescuing people to go to the hospital. The project was so huge that it needed so many approvals, and as much as we know bureaucracy in Syria, I was able, with a lot of, I was so surprised that I got the approvals like very fast. I was thinking it's going to take me a long time to do it. We got so many approvals. We had the Ministry of Defense approval, we had the Ministry of Interior approval, we had the Health Ministry approval. After all, I made a big file that it needed one person's approval, which was the Prime Minister. At that time, his name was Naji. A mutual friend, actually, he gave me an appointment, and I went to his office, and he had a little bit of an overview about the project. I was sitting in his office, and I was explaining about the project to him. Suddenly, in the middle of the presentation, he stopped me, and he said, "Son, listen. I understand 1 plus 1, that's the exact words. 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 5. If you tell me 2 plus 3, I won't understand it." I was shocked. I mean, what is he talking about? I mean, it was really surprising to me. I said, "Well, can I explain it more?" He said, "Well, I think we'll talk about it later." So he took the whole project and he put it in his drawer. I left his office, and after half an hour, my friend called me and said, "Didn't you get the message?" I was like, "What message you're talking about? This is the Prime Minister we're talking about in here." He said, he told you 5. He wants $5 million. It was very straight to my face from the Prime Minister of Syria. If you want this project to go, which is, by the way, it was free for the public. People will get the service for free, and it will provide so many jobs. Will provide so many. Will save so many lives as well. But it won't go through without this. This is just a very simple example about the corruption that has happened over there. Now we're talking about the high level, so we're not going to talk. So imagine this is the highest level you have in the country. Now, for the past 50 years, just like I said, we were controlled and occupied by this regime. Let's go back a little bit before the regime came in and took over the power in Syria. Let's see what was Syria all about. Was it a corrupted country? Was it a country that does not have an economy? Was it a poor country? Was the people living okay, or they're living wrong? No. Syria actually one of the leading country in economy during the 50s and 60s, and that's in the late 60s. Syrian businessmen and women at that time, they have the leading projects in Syria. I remember there is a cement factory, for example, that is still operating till now in Syria, that was owned by one person, that it was the only factory that will export to all the Arab world at that time. After the regime came in, they nationalized the factory, and it started losing money. It's still operating, but it's losing money till now. Syria was the leading country in textile industry. At that time, actually, believe it or not, it was number 2 after China in textile industry. And we were exporting all of this to all, to all the Arab world at that time. Even in the agriculture also. We were number 3 in the world in producing apricots, for example, in the world. All of this has just been destroyed systematically, step by step. Why? Because this regime only wants to control the country. And they know that the only way they can control the country is by controlling the economy. The only way they can control the people is by controlling the economy. Unfortunately, a lot of people, not a lot of people, I would say, some people, they were embedded with the regime. For the past 10 years, since Bashar al-Assad actually took over, the past 12 years since 2000, the Syrians noticed that there is a new people surfaced on the surface, people that nobody heard about them before. In Syria, as it's a small country, the wealthy family, the wealthy rich people, they were very well known. They were hard workers, it's a family business, all of this. But suddenly, from 2000 till 2012, a new names surfaced on the surface, and people that nobody heard about, and they became filthy rich. And actually, all the numbers or all the studies and the statistics shows that they were actually what they were doing is just to money laundering for the regime. The regime that is taking all the money, and those are through their companies and through their connections, they're doing the money laundering for the regime. This is what actually led the revolution. The first day of the revolution, people were not asking about a regime change. They were asking about economic reform. They were asking, the first thing they did in Daraa, for example, they went and they burned the Syriatel headquarters in Daraa, which is owned by the president's cousin, the whole country. The whole company, the Syriatel company, is owned by the president's cousin. So they were going straight to the economy. They were not asking for freedom. They were asking for economic freedom. Now, as Syrian businessmen and women of the business community, we do have a different vision, of course, on the regime. And that's why, we established, a few of us, we established the Syrian Economic Forum. And it's just to show the new government or the people who's going to be in power next in the future, this is our vision for the business people. This is how we want our country to look like. We have a big belief that the next phase for the Syrian economy should be led by the business people. It should not be led by any government. And even if you look throughout the years about the Syrian regime before, there was actually no good straight face for the economy. Was it a socialism? Was it a capitalism? Was it a social market economy? Nobody knew. In a socialism, there is no private ownership. We had so many private ownerships. And in capitalism, there is no public ownership. Now we had so much of those. And the Syrian economy and the social market economy, they tried to implement this for the past 10 years, and it did not work. I believe three of the 5 core elements for the social market economy, they haven't implemented. The first one was the rule of law. There was no rule of law in Syria at all. And then there was the independent, how do I say this? The independent law system. It also does not exist in Syria. All of this that really did not make the social economic market, which they were trying to use, did not work as well. Now, our point of view is we want to engage more for the businessmen and women in Syria, the business community, to be engaged more in the decision making. We want them to be more influenced in making the policy for the new government. And we want Syria to be free economically. We want them to be free from all kind of slavery that we've been living for the past 50 years. And we want our children to live free. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming. I want to begin, of course, by thanking my hosts for the kind invitation. And I'd also like to thank them for starting a discussion about something which, obviously, given events on the ground in Syria, what's happening in Syria, I want to thank them for turning our attention to something that is often overlooked. In addressing some of the questions provided by my hosts, I want to focus rather broadly on issues surrounding business community involvement in the post-conflict phase in Syria. Rather than focusing on specific sectors of the economy or specific areas of the economy where the business community can provide relief and reconstruction, I'm interested in highlighting what I think are two very important and interrelated challenges that the business community will face in the coming decades. In highlighting these challenges, I hope that it will encourage all of us to think about both the possibilities and the limitations of the Syrian business community. I want to kind of have this discussion from a much broader structural perspective. And so I will say from the get-go that this is likely a negative and pessimistic discussion, but hopefully we can end with some positive reflections. The first challenge that I want to discuss is that posed by the rapid depletion of Syrian capital and business assets and the subsequent migration of Syrian capital and business people into neighboring economies. How to repatriate so much of Syria's capital and assets to revitalize the business community will, or at least it should, dominate the discussion that we're having today. It should dominate future discussions about the role of the business community in post-conflict Syria. Indeed, the possibility for the Syrian business community as a whole to play any role in future Syria will be determined not only by an enabling political structure, an enabling policy structure, but by the ability of that business community to marshal assets and resources towards economic activity and reconstruction. By all accounts, the ability of the business community to do so is rapidly eroding. I won't bore you with the numbers, which I actually couldn't find on my laptop on the way up here, but I have them somewhere. There's substantial evidence to suggest that there are hundreds of millions of dollars of Syrian money being taken outside of the country and moved to neighboring countries. This is despite a number of restrictions. The first is, of course, the capital controls imposed by the regime. Very early on in the revolution, there were these ad hoc laws passed to prevent people from taking out more than $10,000 out of the bank. There was one time, I think in 1 week, there were over 400 people who were arrested for violating this. So the regime had actually imposed almost immediately very strict capital controls. But as many of us know, Syrians are very adept at kind of suitcase banking, and were able to get a lot of the money out of the country. On the other side, even though they were able to take the money out of the country, there has been a kind of persistent threat of American sanctions against regional banks, which has prevented many banks, especially in Lebanon, which is where many Syrians are going, from even allowing Syrians to open up bank accounts. So even friends of mine who have nothing to do with business, nothing to do with politics, who are leaving the country have been turned away at Lebanese banks. And I'm not sure if any of you recently saw, but HSBC said that it would be rejecting all bank accounts by Syrian nationals. So there's the pressure of the conflict that is pushing the money outside, and of course the pressure on the outside, which is not providing the space, if you will, for Syrian capital to enter normal means of financial intermediation. Despite that, we see evidence, for example, in southern Turkish banks. There's significant spikes in foreign exchange or foreign currency bank deposits. This is almost certainly represented by Syrian money. There's anecdotal evidence, very kind of more visible evidence of Syrian investments in Egypt. And one thing that I recently saw a lot of in Lebanon was sort of budding partnerships between Syrian business people who are now in Lebanon and Lebanese partners. Of course, in addition to the problem of the movement of Syrian capital and business people abroad, we have to consider the actual physical destruction of the productive capacity of the Syrian economy, including everything from the destruction to infrastructure, the disruption of supply networks, the drying up of contracts. There are virtually no new trade contracts being signed by Syrian producers and regional actors. So all this is to say that the conflict has created multi-directional pressures on the business community as a whole. My own observations suggest, and I'm happy to have a conversation about this, that the duration of the conflict, and not necessarily the political authority that emerges after it, will be a strong determinant of whether these business people return to the country and play a strong role in reconstruction. The reason for this is that as the conflict drags on and Syrian business interests become more entrenched outside of the country, repatriation becomes increasingly difficult. Similarly, as the conflict drags on, the conditions that create these pressures deepen and worsen. So to put it, to kind of wrap the bow around this discussion, the issue becomes about how to both replenish and repatriate Syrian businesses. And from here flows what I think is the second challenge, which will be posed by the inevitable, maybe that's a strong word, but the possible mismatching of post-conflict policy with the structures and capacities of the Syrian business community, which under these current conditions is quite emasculated. One of the many lessons that I think we can learn from the Iraqi reconstruction was how poorly the planners at that time understood the capacity of the Iraqi private sector and the demands of the economy and what it actually needed for its rehabilitation. This is not in any way to suggest that the business community should have a peripheral role in reconstruction. In fact, it's to suggest the opposite. The basic realities of post-conflict Syria will demand a kind of strong and robust role for the business community. Oil capacity, even if it's revitalized to anything resembling pre-revolution capacity, the revenues alone will not be significant to affect reconstruction. The tax base is weak and the tax administration is weak. International aid and funds will be inefficient, although they will surely have some positive outcomes. They will be inefficient to meet all of reconstruction demands. And the range of other revenues that are available to political authorities will simply be limited, or at least too limited to rely simply on this as a source of reconstruction financing. So under these circumstances, there will most certainly be a push towards including the business community in decision-making and reconstruction. However, the policies that emerge in this context must be attentive to the specific structure and the capacities of the business community on the one hand, and the landscape of the Syrian economy on the other. What my colleague is talking about, Faysal has written about the kind of war economy, if you will. If policies are pursued without reference to these two issues, so the Syrian war economy and the structure and capacity of the business community, then we all run the risk of advocating for and implementing or overseeing the implementation of a basket of reconstruction policies that actually marginalize rather than include the Syrian business community. Opening up reconstruction opportunities to regional and global interests, for example, may indeed have positive reconstruction outcomes, but it will not mean the revitalization of the Syrian business community and its embedding in post-conflict decision-making processes. So the best way that I can put this, I think, is that we have to distinguish between the Syrian private sector and the private sector in Syria. I'm not sure if that's quite clear. Sure. I mean, the Syrian private sector is, of course, the indigenous business community that, of course, understands the Syrian economy, is embedded in its kind of social and economic fabric. The private sector in Syria would refer to any regional interests that come in to invest in the country that are not indigenous to the country and to the economy. So I strongly believe that post-conflict policy has to focus on, or has to take seriously how to, again, this the right word, but I hope it communicates what I'm trying to communicate. It has to focus on activating the indigenous business community. So we can't have kind of private sector-led reconstruction for the sake of having private sector-led reconstruction. The Syrian private sector has to be embedded in that process. The reason I bring up this kind of the second challenge is that in my reading thus far of some of the reconstruction projects that are out there, whether those being produced by ESQA the day after and so on, which I think are very substantive and very strong, they represent very strong visions for future Syria. What I don't see is a kind of centralization of the revitalization of the business community. This seems rather peripheral in favor of achieving the more macro economic or macro level achievements that of course we can all agree on, such as attracting investment, stabilizing the currency, and so on. So the two challenges here of revitalizing and repatriating capital as well as matching policy to capacity suggest a number of possibilities for thinking about the role of the Syrian business community in the post-conflict period. We should not assume that there is a business community twiddling its thumbs, waiting on the sidelines, of course. We should also not assume that this is a monolithic business community. Abdul only gave me 10 minutes, so I have to use just talk about the business community as a monolith. But we should certainly not consider it a monolith. But one of the consistencies, if you will, of the Syrian business community, as Ayman alluded to, is that the overwhelming majority of the community is made up of small, what we would consider here, what we would call here small and medium-sized enterprises. I think the last figure I had was like 96% or something like that, which are often embedded in family networks as well. So in addition to thinking big, if you will, about the role of the business community and how the business community can attract investment and things of that nature, I would also encourage all of us to think small, because this is where the overwhelming majority of Syrian business interests reside, and the areas that we don't always look at. We should therefore not discount the role that this small sliver of the business community can possibly play in reconstruction. Indeed, I would go so far as to argue that getting on the right path towards reconstruction depends on strengthening and including this particular segment of the Syrian business community. Otherwise, we run the risk of perpetuating the pre-revolution practices where many of these enterprises operated in a very stifling economic environment with little possibilities for growth and expansion. So to conclude, since I think my time is almost done, I want to summarize some of my thoughts here and how they can speak to the role of the Syrian business community in reconstruction. First, the demand for business community involvement will be high. I think we can almost take this for granted. But the possibilities for such involvement are limited by the depletion of Syria's productive capacities and the embedding of Syrian capital in neighboring economies. Second, the role of the public sector, or the private sector, sorry, can only be maximized through sound policies that have as their central normative goal the revitalization of the business community. In this way, the gap between the need for business involvement and the possibilities for that involvement can be sufficiently bridged. And finally, the inclusion of the business community in post-conflict decision-making processes depends on the type of thinking that takes seriously and accounts for the specific structure of enterprises in the country prior to the revolution and their transformation during it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was really fantastic. Before I go to Faysal, the Syrian Economic Forum is in the process of conducting assessment studies of small and medium enterprises. And I wonder if it's a good project for us to work together on identifying small and medium enterprises that work on construction. And if there's a way we can identify these groups, and then when reconstruction happens, they're there, they're available, and at least they're known. So maybe that's something we need to discuss, and maybe Ayman could address this later. And I just want to also give a heads up to my friend Steve Heidemann that I'm going to go to you right after the three of them. I have a question for you specifically to what he said. Just to be fair, I'm giving you a heads up. Faysal, please.
Yeah, sorry. of course. Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, of course, I'd like to extend my appreciation to CIPE for having me here, and for all of you for listening to me speak about a subject of great intellectual interest to me. There's been a good deal of sort of strong literature on private sector development, post-conflict reconstruction, best practices, and so on. So rather than dwell on like the formal economics of it, I'd like to say something about elites and perhaps explore their role in Syria at the moment, as well as in post-conflict context. And by that, I don't mean just elites in the traditional sense, politicians and wealthy businessmen, and in much of the Arab world, security personnel, but also the sort of civil war elites, or the kind of people who are empowered by violence in particular. Because I think it seems to me we need to determine who exactly this business community is going to be once the fighting stops or dies down in Syria. I agree with Simon. I think the key issue here is duration of fighting. Because unless something strategically changes on the ground, it looks like the civil war in Syria is not coming to an end anytime soon. And I think this poses special challenges to post-war economic development and private sector development. The most obvious of which are the ongoing collapse of the state and economy, of course, the current economic crisis embodied in inflation and currency collapse, and some of the things we've spoken about already. But also I think there are more insidious effects of conflict. The rise of an informal economy, black market, sectarianism that's starting to color pretty much all aspects of Syrian life, the emergence of a new civil war elite, and of course the emergence of masses of unemployed fighters who will somehow need to be reabsorbed in a post-war Syria. I want to draw attention to the example of Lebanon, where some of the same things happened between 1975 and 1990 during its civil war. And what started as a broad sort of two-sided conflict, like in Syria, very soon devolved into a fragmented conflict with many groups, many actors, many front lines, and sort of war of all against all. And what happened here is militia ended up carving out their own respective spheres of economic and political influence. And this fragmentation, or what I call the parochialization of conflict, is almost already underway in Syria. In fact, I would argue it is. And we've seen it embodied in things such as looting, pillaging, and this sort of mentality arising among some of the rebel groups, and I won't say all because that's not true. So civil war sort of takes on an economic logic of its own, if it goes on for long enough. It doesn't become a war over economics, but I think war becoming a money-making enterprise complicates peace efforts and complicates private sector development immensely in a number of ways. I think firstly it undermines the trust that's at the basis of economic interaction and transactions and exchanges, contracts, agreements, laws. It reinforces habits of corruption, patronage, and rent-seeking. It also, I think, perhaps most dangerously, makes it very tempting for people to pursue wealth through political power and military power rather than through private enterprise. The experience of many post-war countries, of course, post-Civil War countries, is that they've somehow had to juggle or find a way to integrate these Civil War elites and fighters into the post-war economy and make peace more profitable to them than war has been. Lebanon did this more or less successfully. The economic results were not great, but the militia were absorbed into the political process mostly. But there are reasons to think it might be more difficult in Syria. In Lebanon, there was a hegemon that sort of oversaw this process and divided up the pie, if you will. And it gave corruption and patronage a sort of predictable quality. And this hegemon, ironically, was Syria, but in Syria, that such a hegemon doesn't appear to be on the scene at all. And of course, all corruption is bad, but perhaps unpredictable and arbitrary corruption is even worse. In Syria, of course, there is no such hegemon, and it makes it much more difficult to decide who gets what. That includes contracts, resources, licenses, and what have you. And of course, there's the issue of fighters and how to absorb them. It's not at all clear to me how the private sector can absorb what's likely to be tens or hundreds of thousands of militiamen. I would argue that it can't and probably won't, and this is probably something for the public sector to do, the bureaucracy and armed forces perhaps. And there is the sort of troubling issue of the pre-war elites and whether or not they're going to survive the conflict. I think some of them will. There's been a lot of discussion about the possibility of a post-war Alawite enclave arising in the northwest, whereby these elites sort of retreat from urban life, set up a bastion, and let go of the lucrative economies of this city. That's possible, I guess, but I think it's actually unlikely, because from what we've seen, minority-led elites don't give up access to economic power that easily. I think they'll do whatever they need to do to ensure they have a stake, and that could be playing a spoiler role in a peace settlement, certainly. So I think in one way or another they're going to have to be involved, and I think that's maybe perhaps unfair to many and maybe economically inefficient as well, but still politically necessary. Now, I recognize it's easy, as you said, for us Middle East observers to prophesize doom and gloom. I think there are positives in Syria. I think we're seeing the rise of a sort of grassroots economic activity on, rather than a status-led economic activity, on the sort of grassroots level of local coordination committees, and I'm sure countless others about whom I don't know. There have been rebel attempts to impose law and order in territories they control. Not all of them are looters, of course. And I think also Syria doesn't have a large oil export industry. This is an immensely complicated economic debate, but I think it's safe to say that oil in polities like that has a distorting impact on market growth, and it's very vulnerable to capture by military and security elites. So just to wrap up, I think the larger point is not that anything is impossible, but that anybody involved in private sector development in Syria faces a really very difficult task. You have to make uncomfortable compromises with unsavory groups, and possibly we'll need to be satisfied with a gradual partial liberalization of the economy that balances economic efficiency with political reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faysal, and maybe we should all give them a round of applause for that. Just like before we go to Steve, just very quickly, I want to introduce Mr. Abboud Khalil, who's with us here today.
Thank you very much.
Abboud is the Chief of Staff of the Office in Washington for the Syrian Opposition Coalition. So thank you very much for joining us. And of course, Mr. Nadim Hafiz, who's the Executive Director for the Syrian Economic Forum. Thank you for being here with us also. My friend Steve Heidemann also, who runs USIP's The Day After project, if I understand correctly. You heard what especially Samer had said about the role of the private sector in the day after and in the future of Syria. How does your project take a look at that, and what are the plans for it?
Well, first, thank you very much, Abdou, for organizing the panel and for bringing such a terrific group together to talk about a very important subject. Ayman was a member of the Day After project and contributed a great deal to the content of that as well. What the Economic and Social Reconstruction Working Group of the project focused on was a strategy for restoring a sense of economic normalcy as quickly as possible, and for addressing immediately and on as large a scale as possible what the members of that working group identified as some of the principal challenges that would emerge immediately following the transition to a post-Assad era. And of course, as the uprising unfolds and as liberated territory becomes consolidated and governance in those areas is now falling into the hands of local actors and eventually an interim government, it will be possible, I think, to begin taking some of these steps even before the Assad regime is gone. But those included things like repatriation of internally displaced, return of refugees, dealing with issues of basic security, dealing with issues of getting the agricultural economy going again. There was recently a report issued from the government itself which indicated that Syrian exports had declined by something like 98%, from about $10.5 billion in 2011 to $135 million in 2012. A lot of that has to do with the absolute collapse of the agricultural economy, absence of diesel for farmers to use agricultural equipment, things like that. Those are some of the things that are going to be reconstruction of property, rebuilding of infrastructure. If it isn't possible quickly to create a sense of economic normalcy, I think many of the subsequent steps that are associated with the rebuilding of economic institutions and the reorientation of Syria's economy away from its former arrangements towards something in which there really is rule of law, in which there really is accountability and so on, are going to be very, very difficult to achieve. So the focus of the report was really on that initial phase. But that's not to say that the participants in the project, all of whom were Syrian, USIP really just played a facilitating role in bringing the Syrian group together, didn't understand that these were just first steps. It was just felt that if they weren't addressed effectively, quickly, the rest would become that much more. Can I exploit the opening you gave me to
Absolutely.
make a comment?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then
Comment
I'm
or question, if you
Not
have.
gonna say anything, because it's been too much. You know, about Dr. Abboud's presentation, you mentioned that you thought that if the conflict continued for an extended period and the Syrian private sector was out of the country for an extended period, the likelihood of return would diminish. And I'm not so sure about that. This is a very mobile private sector. It's a private sector which has historically been quite cosmopolitan, which has built opportunities outside the country while maintaining opportunities inside the country. And there will be such a strong comparative advantage for Syrian business people in a post-Assad Syria that the notion that they would not move quickly to seize those opportunities and to build on that advantage strikes me as perhaps a bit too pessimistic. Now, on the other hand, on sort of less good news, your observation about the potential role of the Syrian private sector in reconstruction. There, I'm a little more uncertain about what the role of the private sector will be, in large part because it is so heavily concentrated in small and medium enterprises. You're going to have the scale of the immediate post-war, post-conflict reconstruction needs are going to vastly exceed the capacity of the Syrian private sector. Much of the funding for reconstruction, and that wasn't discussed on the panel, is going to come from outside. It will come with strings attached. I can tell you that the Turkish construction sector is looking at Syria as a future potential gold mine, and they're not the only ones. So is the South Korean construction sector. And so you're going to have, I think, access to funding for reconstruction that will be contingent on control of reconstruction by foreign lenders. And it isn't clear to me how much of a role, at least in that initial phase of infrastructure rebuilding, the Syrian private sector will play. In addition, if you do allocate a significant share of that work to the Syrian private sector, it's going to happen in a fashion that's very uneven regionally. It's going to happen in a fashion that varies significantly in speed. And you're going to see huge disparities emerge in the pace of reconstruction just based on varying capacity from place to place among the Syrian private sector. And I think that is something to be worried about for political, social, economic reasons, and another reason for caution about where those tasks are likely to end up. But thank you all very much for your panel, and thank you, Abboud, for a chance to talk about the project.
Thank you for taking on my challenge, Steve. I want Samer to answer that question, and anybody from the floor is welcome to join in with comment or questions. But just a comment on your comment, Steve, is that if I understood correctly from Samer, he's not talking about the major construction companies that will take over. I think he's more talking about the supply chain for the smaller companies that lead the work on the ground. And these are the small and medium enterprises we need to focus on. So when the Emiratis come in or the Turks come in, the small and medium manufacturing or construction companies in the country would contribute. But Samer knows a lot better than I do, and I hope he can answer. Then we go back to the audience. I have a couple of questions myself, but we'll see.
Thank you for the support. Thank you, Stephen. I just want to address the second part. I completely agree with you. I actually think that was my concern. I think you actually articulated it a lot better than I did. That my concern is more that this thing we call the Syrian business community, big, small, and everything in between, will simply be smothered by regional capital. I agree with you. I mean, even in Lebanon, I've been going back and forth to Lebanon now for a while. Kind of every couple of months I try and get there. The Lebanese are waiting to get in. Some of the contracts that are being given by, because the regime has a reconstruction committee now, and they have actually started accepting applications. So if, these contracts, some of the people are in Lebanon that are going back and doing this. So everybody is salivating. My concern is that I think you're right, that there are limited capacities, especially in construction, for example. And there will be Gulf interest, there will be Turkish interest, South Korean, Chinese, et cetera, that will come in. But how does that not smother the capacity and just perpetuate the kind of marginalization of the Syrian business community? No, I certainly didn't mean to suggest that the Syrian community could do this all on its own. My little kind of comments about revenues, the point I left out was that they also can't finance it. And no matter who emerges after this, that the money will be, by definition, I mean, they don't have the tax base, they don't have the oil money, they don't have all of these other things that we would consider could finance it. On the second point, I also agree. That is an excellent point about the mobility of the private sector. You're right. I perhaps was a bit too pessimistic. I've had a bad week. I certainly also am very, very hesitant to speak again in kind of monolithic terms about the business community. I'll tell you a couple of experiences that informed that comment about kind of staying on the outside. One is my family. Two different parts of my family in Aleppo and Damascus simply can't wait it out anymore, and now they're migrating. They're going to the west. They had one of them had a refrigeration company and the other a distribution company. Of course, my family doesn't mean everybody, but this is evidence that we're seeing elsewhere. Another thing that I saw in the course of my trips to Lebanon was that a while ago, my sense was that many Syrians had a kind of waited out attitude. And so they would come to Beirut, and there was this sense of temporariness to them being in Beirut. And they would actually, some on a daily basis, some on a weekly basis, drive back into the country to check on what was happening in their businesses, in their shops. And I mean, we're in the third year now. That's just not possible for many people. And so the waited out attitude is, now what do I do? You know, I mean, I'm now depleted, and it's 2 years in, a lot of my assets are depleted, and so some are looking to migrate, some are looking to embed themselves in Lebanon, in Abboud, around the area where I have family in Lebanon. There's all these Syrian restaurants that are propping up now, and the only conclusion I have is that they got sick of waiting it out. The other point, and I would certainly welcome any thoughts from anybody in the audience about this, was this really bizarre informal exchange that happened between opposition officials and regime officials around Egyptian businessmen. I'm not sure if anybody here is familiar with this, but there's an opposition official who came out and said that a third of the Syrian business community there was some crazy number, had now left to Egypt, had invested over $500 million in Egyptian textiles, in Egyptian industry, and were supportive of the revolution. A few days later, a regime official came out and said, well, they're actually right, but we've been in contact with them, and they're really excited to come back when all this mess ends. And I couldn't figure out how to think about this. I mean, here you have the regime and the opposition laying claim to this large segment of the business community. And then there was a debate about the numbers. So I think the opposition said 500 million, and the regime said, well, it's actually only about 150 million. I mean, who cares at that point? I mean, there's an embedding going on there that I think has consequences. I agree with you that the Syrians will certainly be eager to come back into the country, but the mobility of the assets after a few years, I think, will be diminished. Their kind of embedding in regional economies might just deepen. So yes, they might participate, but we've also still had the movement of the assets outside.
If you allow me, probably to anyone like in the panel, but just on the subject, I always like to think in a positive manner. The regional competition, and also like Dr. Stevens is more than welcome to comment on this. The regional competition on having a stake and having string attached, personally I see it probably as an advantage for whoever the new government of Syria to try to utilize this to include the small businesses in some capacity, in some kind of partnership, in some kind of trying to negotiate on their behalf to have partnership. Because I think personally, on a personal level at least, in the first phase, we're going to have more of a partnership to move toward more and more like liberal open economy. So do you think that's something can be worked on, or you think that's something, because when you have so many countries interested in Syria and the reconstruction efforts, then probably that would be a competitive advantage on our part to be able, especially as a government, to negotiate on your behalf and to do the partnership on this. Secondly, I think as a business community, I'm sure there are some ways that we can make we can make attractive, at least as a phase, as the first phase in the first 5 years or 10 years for people. What are some ways that you can guys think of to make attractive movement, laws, loans, efforts that can make it or facilitate the return of capital to inside Syria after the regime falls?
Maybe you can answer maybe the three issues.
Oh, well, no, actually,
Faysal?
I would defer to Sabit about the capital issue in particular, but about the issue of the foreign stake and the involvement and the interest there. Yeah, certainly I think that could be good in terms of a source of raw capital. Yeah, definitely, I think that's key actually, and a number of us have touched on it. But I think there's also two issues that are more worrying. One is that these regional actors, if you will, because they're not all states, are actually rivals to a large extent, and they tend, because many of them are very wealthy, their investment decisions, their aid decisions tend to reflect their political calculations and their affiliations. This is particularly the case with the GCC countries. I'm sure will probably be quite involved in a post-war economy. So there's that issue of the politicization and sort of the divvying up of foreign investment. And there's also the issue of transparency, which is that it's very difficult to get a good sense of how these states make their decisions about where the money goes, who it's actually going to, and what their criteria are. I remember the sort of a story I was told by somebody close to the head of the Qatari Central Bank following the revolution in Egypt, whereby, I don't know if you've been following the fact that they've been withdrawing aid and then offering it to the Egyptians and then holding it back, and then it's been a crazy process. And the central banker has said as much as, listen, this is not a central bank or even an economic decision. This is something that the prince decided has to happen, the emir. And if he changes his mind, then the policy changes. So I think that's, adds a layer of complexity to it. Doesn't doom it, absolutely not. But something to bring up.
Ayman, Sana?
Actually, of course, just like what Steve said earlier, that there's a lot of countries are just waiting just to jump on this market and try to re-engage in the rebuilding the country, especially in the reconstruction business and the reconstruction. Now, the estimated Syrian capital outside Syria for Syrians is over $100 billion, and that's something I think when we were in Dubai a few months ago. There was a conference over there in Dubai about the partnership between the Syrian and the government of Abu Dhabi. At the end of the conference, some businessmen they committed, and I'm talking Syrian businessmen, not foreign, to right away after the regime is over to go ahead and invest $5 billion right away. That was right after the conference, which was only one day. So the numbers again, it's about $100 billion. Our target as a businessman is also to bring those people. Now I completely in favor of bringing foreign companies that have expertise in rebuilding, because that's going to make it really fast. It's not going to make the country look weird. You have a big building and a small building. We need a big structure for it and a nice structure. But I really don't believe that this is going to happen right away after the revolution is over. And let's take Lebanon, for example. The civil war was ended in 1991. I think the investment did not came to Dubai, to Lebanon until like 2000 up. So the capital, whoever wants to invest, he's looking for a safe area. And I don't, as much as I would love to see it, but I don't think that after the regime is gone, that Syria is going to be really safe to go ahead and invest. If you are a businessman and you have and you have your money, you don't want to go ahead and invest it in unstable area. Let's put it in to brackets now. Lebanon took them about 10 years to get those investments in, about 10 years. So during those 10 years, who was working in this country? The SMEs, the small and medium business enterprises, which is, that's going to be a very big boost for the one that we have right now. So there's not going to be any conflict between the SMEs and the companies that's going to come from outside. Our target, again, is just to bring the Syrian businessmen, Syrian money who were living outside Damascus, Syria for all their lives, and want to bring them in. And at the same time, we will have a chance to develop and increase the business for the SMEs. Thank you.
Those are very interesting questions. Thank you for your optimism. I think on the point about liberalization, the kind of day after, you know, I actually don't have a solid answer to both your thoughts, but both your questions, but I have some thoughts. I think that what happens the day after needs to make sense 20 years down the road. I think that the things that happen the day after, and this is why I appreciate it, certainly the thinking about the day after project, is that they're for humanitarian reasons, for relief reasons, for political reasons, for reasons of trust between communities, trust between people and political authorities. There needs to be a series of things that occur almost immediately the day after. And certainly what happens in terms of liberalizations or in terms of facilitating economic activity in the country the day after will have long-term consequences. I certainly think that people shouldn't, you know, I certainly make these decisions with my children all the time. You know, you give them a candy, you say it's not going to have an effect later on, then they ask you for another one an hour later. You know, I think those kinds of decisions need to essentially be avoided. There has to be some kind of long-term intergenerational thinking even about how liberalization occurs. So if for example, if the consensus is something along the lines of what happened to Iraq, I mean, I think this will ultimately spell disaster for a lot of the Syrian business community. To move to the second point about how to facilitate the repatriation, I mean, I think this is an extremely difficult question. I mean, on the one hand, we can think kind of institutionally about the institutions of intermediation, so like the banks. So strengthening the banks or thinking about the role of the banks so that there's actually a place for the money to go back to. This is actually something that I can't quite wrap my head around, is that there's a lot of Syrian money that is I don't know how to describe it, it's almost just floating around. I mean, it's not in regional banks. Last quarter was the first quarter since the revolution that Lebanese banks showed an increase, any meaningful increase. It was 6% in foreign currency deposits. But yet, for anybody who's gone to Lebanon, I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of Syrians there. How we're not seeing a rise in the deposits. So facilitating the re-entry, the repatriation of the money would be certainly important. Another thing is that I certainly think would be beneficial is establishing, and this can certainly occur now, the kinds of institutions that would support small enterprise development in ways that I think can establish trust between business people and those institutions. So a couple of years ago, the reason I'm thinking about this, that a couple of years ago the Syrian government announced this $50 million trade bank, so something of that nature. And so I happened to be in Damascus a few months after this happened, and I was doing a lot of interviews in the countryside. And almost every single person I'd ask, I'd say, what's your biggest problem to growth? What's the biggest obstacle to growth? And they said, we don't have the resources to trade. And I said, well, guess what? You know, I mean, the government just passed up this thing, and there's an application, and you can go. And every single person laughed at me. They said, you know, are you crazy? I'm not going to go get money from that. I mean, and then I'd say, well, no, but seriously, I mean, I can actually have this article. I can show you that there's this thing, and just there was no trust there in that institution. And I think things of that nature that can provide the kinds of supports that some you know, some slivers of the business community would need would go a long way in actually encouraging people to come back. So there has to be, of course, the institutional thing, but there has to be supports outside of that as well.
Thanks a lot. I'll wait for questions, but I have my own, if I may. Just following up with this conversation, which I liked a lot, about what happens in liberalizing the economy afterwards. There's definitely a conflict right now, and we see it being manifested in Egypt, Tunisia. I'll leave the Iraq example from later. But if we talk about Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, where the immediate pressures on the three governments are on more state employment, more subsidies, and that's natural. That's what's needed after a conflict like that. You know, that's what we're seeing happening in the three countries. And in our visits to the three countries, we hear policymakers, Islamist and non-Islamist, secular or Islamist, all talking about the need to liberalize the economy, the need for the private sector to be where the jobs are generated, the need to strengthen small and medium enterprises so there's more opportunity, more economic opportunity for everybody. Yet in public, the policies are more on subsidies, on state employment. And you alluded to the issue of all these combatants, that only the public sector will be able to absorb them. For an already bloated government institutions, this will only make the problem worse. So I see a conflict. Is there a solution to this? Is it through building the proper institutions? Is it through laws and regulations that make sure the private sector is engaged in making jobs in the future? Or are we doomed in Syria, like it looks like we're doomed in Egypt and Libya right now? How do we tackle this huge dilemma for the immediate short-term needs to employ these combatants, to create subsidies for people to eat, etc., but in the long term have the private sector be a vibrant place for good jobs with dignity for the people of Syria? I want the three of you to answer.
I just want to, you know, Abboud, I totally agree with everything that you said right now.
I had a conflict, I had nothing to say. I need answers.
It's just I think before the revolution is over, what we need to do is we need to be ready. For example, the day after project, it's called the day after, so we can be ready. The private sector institutions, think tanks, organizations, they have to be ready with solutions before the revolution is over. Whenever the revolution is over, they're going to be, the government, whoever is going to be in power as far as politics, they're not really going to be busy looking for solutions. They're going to be busy fighting over power. And we all know that. This happened in Libya, happened in Tunis, it's going to happen everywhere. I mean, we're not that special as Syrians. You know? So my belief and my understanding is organizations who are, especially getting the business people involved in the policy making, they have to make those rules and regulations from now and make it ready and then present it to the new government who's going to be in power. And you can tell them, okay, this is what we have for you. You don't have to waste your time and waste your resources and take you years to find solutions. Because if we want the investors to come in and do their investments, they're not going to come with an old laws that we have. In Syria, right now, if we can use the same laws that we have, which is you can enter money, but you cannot exit the money. I mean, what am I going to do with my money? Oh, you're going to keep it inside the country, keep invested, and then you spend it in Syria. You cannot take it out. Well, I mean, and I'm assured to you that those things is not going to change right away if we are not ready for it. And that's what we're trying to do. If you, Abdul, want those rebels to go ahead and be engaged with, and not be employed by the government and going to be engaged in the civil life, we have to find them jobs. The only way we can find them jobs is if the private sector came in and made the investments and opened the jobs, and then they absorb those people, you know, instead of being in the streets and holding the guns. And the only way we can bring those people again is by getting those studies and those laws ready to be, you know, implemented. Thank you.
Faysal.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think it's one we've always sort of been wrestling with since the Arab Spring broke out. I definitely recognize that tension and between statism and sort of public sector-led growth and the long-term health of the economy. I also think it's safe to say now that the Arab sort of experiment with these statist economies has failed after several decades of trying. And I think there is a general consensus about what the sound economic vision for the region would be. And that's moving away from over-reliance on the public sector. But I also recognize that there are going to be immediate sort of emergency needs once fighting dies down. And I think the only way to escape this tension eventually is to build governments that are perceived as legitimate, fair, and have a strong enough social contract so that populations are not going to turn on their states the second difficult economic decisions are taken, such as liberalization or subsidy reform or tax reform, and start, protesting in the street and handicapping political and economic life immediately, which is exactly what we're seeing in Egypt right now, where it's become, for better or worse, rightly or wrongly, impossible for the government to do anything of economic use. So I think if we concentrate on building a just political order, then further down the line, once the emergency has passed, if you will, then that will give the government some leeway to make difficult decisions that they do need to make, and I recognize that. But I think unless you build your political order on that sort of justice and legitimacy, these things are going to be impossible to do.
Let me follow up on that, if I may, Faysal. So you're talking about legitimacy of the government. Are you suggesting a broad-based government that's more representative of different sectors, or are you saying a government with enough of a mandate to force a certain political position?
I think that touches on the issue, the very weird and tricky issue of legitimacy, and I recognize that. And I think, no, I don't mean just a mandate as in a government chosen in an election.
Yeah.
Because that's obviously not enough. What I'm talking about is not so much that they won this or that election or that this or that policy is correct or incorrect. I think what this touches on is whether or not even governments that make bad decisions have a right to make them, whether that particular government does that. And if it is perceived as allowed to make mistakes without overthrowing the order, then it is legitimate. In the case of Syria, there is the sectarian element, which is very different than Egypt, very different situation. And yes, that will be about it being an inclusive political order, absolutely. I think it's a good guess that it will be dominated by one sect in the country, the majority sect, but not as we saw in Iraq, hopefully not, where everybody else is pushed to the periphery. So yeah, absolutely. I think in the case of a pluralistic polity, then yes, it's about inclusivity.
There's an article in there, Faysal. No, you answer this question first, then we'll go.
Okay. So
you're not escaping this.
So I guess because I'm the third one to answer, I have the luxury of pretending like I don't remember all of the questions. I want to kind of reiterate a point I was saying earlier. So in the 2000s, if you look at the Syrian Economic Society, one of the debates that occurred in there was this idea of anchoring Syria's policies to something on the outside. So when you liberalize trade with Turkey, when you enter into a free trade agreement with Turkey, how does this act as an anchor for the business community? This was that for those who supported the Euromed partnership, free trade with Turkey, free trade, the Great Arab Free Trade Area. This was essentially the argument that we can't compete, right? Right now, but if we pass these things, then that's the anchor, and that's what we're going to get to. And I think that planning, suggestions, policy, etc., the day after, whether in regards to the public sector or the private sector, has to think about the anchoring role that it actually plays over the long term. We have to be extremely wary of trying to achieve immediate short-term needs through quick fixes that have long-term distortions. So we can all agree that Syria's agricultural sector needs rehabilitation. I mean, this is what 1.2 million people in the labor force were employed here. We know that much of the fighting occurred here, much of the destruction occurred in the agricultural sector. But we also have to keep in mind that the regime had almost a policy of neglect towards agriculture. Its only significant policy that I can think of was to incentivize the production of a certain number of crops that actually distorted the production of a wide-ranging number of crops. There was somebody who told me there was a saying in Damascus that the health of the economy, you could always see the health of the country, by the number of fruits that were in the market, something to that effect. And over time, that ability to produce kind of wide-ranging, high-yield crops, etc., was decimated by a combination of neglect, drought, the depletion of machinery, etc. So I think we have to account for those things and think in the long term how the immediate day after policies will look, not only in first, second, third year, but in year 20. The reason that I was thinking about this was that I was recently at a conference in November. It was a Syrian diaspora conference in New York, and there were 3 different people who in 3 different sessions said that Syria should just be turned into a big sweatshop. That was the actual language that they used, and if you turn Syria into a sweatshop, then we don't need to have this discussion anymore. I was actually quite baffled by not only the language, but the assumptions that, I mean, the thinking is right, that you need you need policies that encourage labor-intensive employment. That is correct. But to assume that you could just sort of open up this, some sort of factory or something, I don't know, somewhere between Damascus and Halab, and say, let's just, all Syrians who are unemployed go there, and we'll bring investments, and you'll all have low-paying, really crappy jobs. I mean, this is was really baffling to me, and I think those are the kinds of things that have to be avoided. There has to be intergenerational thinking, there has to be forward thinking, and there has to be thinking about how the policies that are recommended to future political authorities serve as anchors for a future, not necessarily just the present. And that's of course not to suggest that the relief and reconstruction demands should be sidelined in favor of some sort of imaginary 20 years down the road, but it's to suggest that the two can and probably should go hand in hand.
I'll go to you right now, I promise, but just want to encourage you all to read today in the MENA source of the Atlantic Council a paper by Faysal, Itani, on the economics of civil war in Syria. And I also want to plug the Syrian Economic Forum. Our participant Ayman is the chairman, and of course Nadeem, the executive director, where they're striving very, very hard to get a voice for the private sector in policy making in Syria. And right now they're doing it through two different initiatives. One is to develop policy papers in coordination with the opposition groups about important issues in Syria, including construction, including agriculture. What are the policies that are needed in the future? So they're working on those on one hand, and on the other hand, they're working on assessments in the field of what's available, what's needed, where can investments go to help, especially small and medium manufacturing plants, industries, and so when investment's available, it can go to the right place. And we wish you luck, and this is an amazing job you're doing, and hopefully it will work out. Young lady.
Yes. Hi, I'm Pam Beecroft. I work here at SIPE as the North Africa Program Officer. But before that, I, for 5 years, was doing demobilization and reintegration programs for militias. And so, given that you just brought that up, and given that Abboud also brought it up, I wanted to say something from my experience. I did it in Greater Great Lakes region, which tends to have revolving door demobilization in certain areas happening, and then cyclical violence. But, in my experience there, this is a comment, but I look forward to a reaction. In my experience there, in the end, it still all comes down to economic absorption capacity of a country. And that depends on SMEs flourishing. Because even if you absorb 90% of a variety of militias into security sector and bureaucracy, two things happen. One, you often end up basically preserving command and control of all of these militias. So you end up basically laying the groundwork for fiefdoms later on within the bureaucracy, which does not make for good governance, to say the least. And second of all, you end up kicking the can of security sector reform down the line. And much as people tend to sort of avoid that directly post-conflict, it does not become a more politically palatable process later. Just the political problems that arise are different, but no one wants to touch it, and no one keeps wanting to touch it, because then you end up furloughing a bunch of basically often, what would I say, unqualified or not properly qualified former militia members into an economy that can't absorb them. So it still all comes back around, and on top of that, obviously, you'll have a youth population with the same problems. So you end up with young former militia members plus, and then probably also retiring older, also unqualified, militia and army members who have a certain idea of what their position in life should be. And I mean, it's, having been part of it, and you can hear the passion in my voice, it becomes very, very complicated. So in the end, still this question of economic absorption becomes key. And it becomes key for everybody, not just militia members or anybody else, because if you don't work on that, you end up right back where you started, with frustrated young populations who tear things apart and create a lot of problems.
comment? Faysal?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my comment is a boring one because I agree with you. I think the security forces and giving them a very major role in post-conflict situations is perilous at best, and encourages all sorts of the wrong types of behavior by soldiers, as well as what you said, the sort of security people who build an empire and have a sense of entitlement and end up actually absorbing most of the revenues of the state. In a lot of cases. So I would think, I wouldn't concentrate on the security sector per se. I don't think that's maybe a very immediate emergency solution, but certainly not even a medium-term one. I think I was thinking more along the lines of state-driven industry, jobs, the bureaucracy, and what have you, that may be not very economically efficient or congruent with pro-market or liberal reform, but still necessary. And there's also the issue of, the sort of investment needed to, as you said, the investment needed to nurture this SME environment. That takes a while. And the only alternative to that, if you want to start pushing growth very fast and creating the infrastructure for that, is just immense public debt borrowing, which brings with it its own set of risks, and probably will end up happening anyway in a place like Syria, but just something to highlight.
And I wonder if there's a lesson in the areas where there was prolonged uprising. You see what's going on in Libya today, and the conflict before that in Lebanon, and what happened, and what they're doing right now in Lebanon, little medium to longer term, and Libya, what's going on right now, huge problems. And Syria definitely falls within that, and going on for longer than anywhere else. So these are serious issues that have to be addressed. Unless there's a final question, maybe I give the final comment to the people who want to say final words before we close out. You had 10 minutes.
Can I have just like
Absolutely,
very,
absolutely.
probably like you raised a very important issue, and just a thought to throw it about that, experts to have your instead of and I always think of partnership between always, like especially in the first phase, I believe everyone have to come together to be able to do something, and always actually this is you touched on something. Probably the most important issue, even we recognize it internationally now when we deal with a lot of people. Everyone focus on civilians, civil activists, not addressing the people with the guns that they're going to have a lot of says if they're not absorbed in one way or another. So instead of absorbing them in security sector or army or putting them in government jobs, the government will have to spend money, whether it's borrow money, but it will have to spend resources. And I think of some of the initiatives that I've seen here and learned in business here in the US about using these funds to motivate business or to put it in a grant to train and qualify these people to then integrate into the business life. So to help, because like no business probably is going to say, we're going to pay you for a year until you get qualified, but if this is a partnership or a grant from the government, say, we'll cover the salary or we'll do it in a rebate or a tax cut, whether we all know no one pays property taxes in Syria, but anyway, in some form of something to be given for the private. Free car from the intelligence, like security. Like there are a lot of cars in Syria. So it's some kind of incentive and to train and make them qualified so they can integrate then into the security sector. So what's your thought? Is it feasible, crazy idea, never gonna work?
It's really like a small business loan. Like a small business loan to give to people and
No, I think what he's talking about is that it's a government initiative, but not to integrate them into the security services where they become more of a problem, but instead to offer some kind of either an incentive to the private sector to train them and integrate them into jobs within the private sector, or a government-run, if I understand correctly, training program. So these combatants go to the training program, develop skills so they become employable in the private sector. I mean, it's a terrific idea, I'm sure, but I'm no expert. I don't know if any of you is an expert to comment on that. But I think there's a lot of need for a study about that, and maybe the economic forum.
It can be tailored, and that's something could be done probably even with the refugee at this point, because instead, I believe that the business community can play a vital role in this, in saying, we think immediately we're going to need people with this trade quality or this intellectual quality, and then a training program can be put in place to be specifically just like focused toward these things. And at the same time, even like for the first few months, I've seen it, I think, I can't remember where, but it's in some countries, they do like 3-month paid. The salary is paid by the government 90 days or 30 days or something while they are employed by the company. They can be hands-on, like training on the job while they're doing this, and then they can be like kind of a paid, highly paid intern, not like interns in DC.
I mean, we talked about the needs for reconstruction. We don't want to just throw ideas. I don't know if it's done before. You've done it before I had it. But the idea of integrating them into the construction business, to train them in construction business, and the companies that hire more of them get preferential granting deals with the government, something like that. I'm sure, I'm no expert, I don't know how it's done, but I'm sure Steve has a comment.
Well, no, I just wanted to make an observation. If you look at the composition of those who are participating today in the uprising, a large number are civilians who've left employment, left jobs, left farms in order to take up arms. It's not beyond imagining that once the conflict ends, we won't face a problem of absorbing this large mass of unemployed fighters into some sector of the economy with which they're unfamiliar. They'll return to their villages, they'll return to their farms. It's going to be a very difficult transition period before their activity can resume any degree of normalcy. But I would suspect that actually the percentage of those who are now full-time combatants is very, very small relative to the total.
True, Steve, but two factors on this, and the people who work with me know when I say two factors, I always forget the second one. Let me start with the first one before I forget the first one.
Looking at the clock, that's a good thing.
The longer this takes, and Lebanese civil war will tell us, the more they become professional fighters, and it's hard to reintegrate them. So the faster the solution, the easier we can find jobs for them. And so that's number one. Lebanese example, the militias right now are these young people who fought in the war are still fodder for these the political fighting inside Lebanon. And the second, these people left jobs that they were not happy in. This was a statist economy where bloated people didn't have to go to jobs. They were not happy in their jobs. So we need to provide private sector-led jobs for them to have some dignity about making money and fighting for a job instead of just depending on the government. So these are two things that need to be addressed, and we can't assume that even if we have transition periods for them to come back, they will go back to their old jobs. That might not work. I agree with you 50%, but we need also to address these two issues.
The second issue.
These are the two.
Oh, sorry.
I said it too. Unless do you have any final comments you want to address? Anything final? All right. I want to thank you all for coming. And on behalf of you, I want to thank the three speakers for